So I have to say that I found this particular film so riveting. I couldn't stop watching it, and I was making notes the entire time. So when I have to do more research on this, I have to find out more about this. But we'll get into that in just a few moments. My name is Mark Catrick. I'm here at the Museum of Tolerance, and it is my pleasure to welcome you this evening. Let me tell you a little bit about the folks who are up here on the stage, and then we will have a little bit of a conversation this evening. So just to my left is Jonathan Petropoulos, Dr. Petropoulos. You recognize from the film. Is an American historian specializing in National Socialism and Nazi looted art, currently serving as the John V. Crowell Professor of European History at Claremont McKenna, previously taught at Loyola College in Maryland, and was the research director for the Presidential Advisory Commission on Holocaust Assets. Dr. Petropoulos has testified as an expert witness in several high-profile legal cases involving looted art, including the Altman case, which we'll talk about in just a moment, and the Cassirer case. And he's authored a number of books on Nazi-era art and politics, and has appeared in the documentary The Rape of Europa about looted art in Europe. Thank you for being here. Next to him is Simon Goodman. So Simon was here at the museum the last time on this stage for his book, The Orpheus Clock, The Search for My Family's Art Treasure Stolen by the Nazis, and was one of the subjects and was interviewed in the film this evening. Born in London shortly after World War II, Simon Goodman entered the music business in the late 1960s, specializing in breaking new British artists abroad. Goodman is married to the actress and teacher May Quigley, has a son and 3 daughters, and he lives here in Los Angeles, where his search for his family's treasures continue. And at the last but certainly not least, Randy Schoenberg. Randy is a lawyer and a genealogist based here in Los Angeles, specializing in legal cases related to the recovery of looted or stolen artworks, particularly those by the Nazi regime during the Holocaust. Randy represented Maria Altman in her suit to obtain 5 Gustav Klimt paintings from the estate of Ferdinand and Adele Bloch-Bauer, as well as the Palais, the Viennese house in which the paintings were housed. Altman won her case before the US Supreme Court against the government of Austria in 2004, and the paintings were eventually returned to the Altman family. Schoenberg, yes. I have to say, Randy, in your honor, I'm wearing my Gustav Klimt socks. We should get, do you have a pair? I think you probably have every permutation of Klimt paraphernalia that's out there.
Umbrella,
Yeah. So I wanted to begin this evening with, let's just, it's an easy question. It's not, there's no easy questions. But this film, for me, paints such a vivid picture of post-war complicity. And then this question is to all of you. How much of the art world today, museums, private collectors, are still contending with the legacy of that silence that we so vividly heard about in this film?
I guess I'll start. We'll go down the line. I see the film as divided into 2 segments. The first part is about plundering, and it's supposed to give you a feeling of up close and personal with a Nazi art plundered, with this experience. And a book I wrote over 25 years ago called The Faustian Bargain, about hands-on experts in the art world. I tried to do this, but it was a very superficial book. In Faustian Bargain, there's no treatment of any individual over 30 pages. We just didn't know that much about those individuals then. There was data protection laws, and this was an opportunity to get, as I said, up close and personal with a Plundered, right? And so I think that's what Hugo McGregor, the filmmaker, is able to do in the first half of the film. And the second, it tells a story about what happens to the plunderers after World War II. I mean, you just watch the film, you know this. But to show that so many rehabilitated their careers and they became part of the legitimate art world, right? And, there were surprising connections to the art world. That theater, Ted Rousseau, was a link to Loza is astonishing, right? Because you saw that he was an OSS officer. He knew more about Nazi art plundering than any individual in the world at the time. And the fact that he takes advantage of this relationship, that to me spoke volumes, right? So those are the two halves of the film that I see. The first part to take you there and make you proximate, and you can feel what it's like to have your possessions stolen. And the second, when you see it's not just ancient history. And to answer your question a little bit more, I was struck by Ann Weber's comment. There's so many works we're looking for we haven't found, or what Simon's been doing for decades now, looking for his family collection. So there's a lot of unfinished business of World War II, and I think the film conveys that. Simon?
Thank you. Well, one of the reasons there's so much unfinished business is because it's so difficult when you do locate an artwork to actually get it back. Claimants like myself have to prove we are who we say we are. We then have to find documents that prove that we bought the painting. Then we have to prove we didn't sell them willingly. So the onus is on the victim's heirs to prove a perfect case. I've had claims, successful claims, ultimately in about 10 different countries. In no instance did I not come up with enormous resistance. I can name maybe on half of one hand two museums that actually cooperated and returned things quite sort of swiftly. Even though they were all pretty much all aware of the true origins of those artworks and how they ended up in their establishments, I still, and not just I, all the claimant families have to go through hoops. I mean, my grandfather's paperwork was burnt by the Germans to begin with, so I'm at a little disadvantage. Ironically, I rely on Nazi records to prove that, the good news and the bad news is they did 3 very comprehensive inventories of my grandparents' home that totaled about 1,500 pieces. So I'm still looking for about 600 of those. But some cases, most cases take between 7 and 10 years. So nobody is making it easy for us, even when they sign on to the Washington Principles. Even in principle, they say, yes, but when it comes to money, prove it. And that's a different story. Anyway, pass it on to a lawyer.
Yeah, sorry. So I was going to also mention Ann Weber's comment there. She was the director. She is the director of the Commission for Looted Art, and she says 90% of her clients' artworks are not recovered. You just heard Simon talk about his family. I can give another example. Maria Altman's brother-in-law, so her husband's older brother, Bernhard Altman, had also an enormous collection. He fled just ahead of the Nazis in March of 1938 from Vienna. In June, so March, April, May, June, right? In June, there was a full auction of everything in his home with a printed catalog detailing everything in the home. That included all the artworks, and of the artworks, there were 4 paintings by Canaletto, an artist that was mentioned in the film, 3 photographs in the published catalog for this, and only 1 has been recovered. And these are artworks that are worth maybe $10 million now. We did recover one over 20 years ago, and it was I think $3 or $4 million at that time. So it's these are very valuable artworks. They weren't burned, most likely, they weren't thrown away. They're somewhere, right? They're hanging on someone's wall, and what happens is the person dies, they find it in a vault, they have it on the wall, and then the family has to figure out what to do with it. Some families go to an auction house, and then maybe someone gets notified that there's a stolen painting, but other ones stay basically underground. And so there's just a lot of these out there. And then to echo what Simon said about the difficulty, especially with museums, in the film, just remember that beautiful castle, Neuschwanstein, right? So during that section afterward, they showed some of the artworks that the monuments men recovered that had been taken for Hitler's collection and Goering's collection. And two of the paintings that Hermann Goering had were these Adam and Eve portraits by Lucas Cranach the Elder. You can see those in the Norton Simon Museum. They were completely stolen, looted artworks taken by Goering from the Houtsticker family in Holland, and then discovered at the Norton Simon Museum. And the Norton Simon Museum refused to give them back, fought the case, and which lasted many years, and won on a legal principle called the Act of State Doctrine, which just says that a U.S. court won't judge the acts of a foreign state, in this case the Netherlands, that refused to return the property and then ended up selling them to the person who sold them to Norton Simon. So though, if you want to see 100% looted artworks, just go to the Norton Simon Museum in Pasadena. I mean, but it's a real tragedy, and I think a very good example of, even in the United States, where we think of ourselves as much more open to these type of restitution claims, there is a lot of resistance and difficulty.
Thank you so much for that. And it just begs the question, so then, what does justice look like once restitution is no longer possible? What happens when decades have passed? Or, we open up a Swiss vault at 100 years from now and we find paintings. How do we even begin to unpack those kinds of situations?
Well, I like to think that restitution is always possible. And there was an effort back in the late 1990s to resolve the issue of Nazi looted art. That's what Stuart Eisenstadt, one of the leaders of restitution, was trying to do. And he realized that it's not something you can fix at one time. It's a complex of issues that's going to be with us for the rest of our days and our children's and grandchildren's days, right? In America, you cannot have good title to stolen property, right? And so there's always an ability to go back and take and return it to the person who was stolen from. It's different in Europe, and that's one of the reasons why it's so important to litigate these cases in the United States, and Randy's incredible accomplishment with Oscar v. Altman getting standing in a U.S. court, because it's a different European law where they have the idea of a good faith purchase. So in Europe, it's probably going to be different, but in America, I know I will be helping Holocaust victims for the rest of my days, and this work will continue. There will be no closure. What else can one do besides return the work, which is the most important thing? Yes, there are labels. You can put didactics up in the museum and acknowledge the history, and that's something. There's alternative dispute resolution. The museum keeps the artwork, and maybe they do something else that's acceptable to the claimant family. So there are other things one can do besides return the painting. But as you all know, I think these families have lost so much during the Holocaust. The least we can do is return the artworks to them, right? And that has to be our first objective, and our first goal is to correct this injustice in this way. But the work will continue, I think, in perpetuity. That's my thinking.
Well, in my experience of all the things that are still missing out there, a huge percentage of them are actually hiding in plain sight, and they're hiding behind various laws. And but there are all sorts of other tricks and games. Willy Cotte in the movie talked about the art world being anyway. One of the things I've come across is that, especially with sculptors, painters, artisans, or whatever kind, in so many cases, the names of the artists have been changed. The titles of the works have been changed. Then the provenances I found, the first painting I ever found was in Chicago, and in the Provenance, my grandfather had just been erased, and some obscure German living in The Hague had been put in his place, and so on. So we, you know, families like mine are sort of erased from the history books in a sense. So much of it is identifiable somewhere. The problem is it's very rare that a family, a claimant family like mine, has 100% conclusive proof, because without that, you're relying on the goodwill of the collectors, the art. I mean, a big factor is the big auction houses in the US, in the UK, in France, wherever, don't have to tell you. In fact, will never tell you who the consignor is. You know, when I inherited my father's books, you know, all his art books, I was stunned to find, you know, Sotheby's catalogs from, you know, even after the war, didn't mention any owners, except on the rare occasion there was one where I remember it said, property of a lady. What sort of lady? But so it's out there, but there's so many walls behind which the collectors, the galleries, and the museums can effectively hide or defend themselves that, you know, I mean, then there's always the concept that a lot might have gone to Russia or South America, but out of all the pieces I've recovered so far, they've all been in North America or Western Europe, because that's where the money is.
So on the question of justice, I think it depends, you know, on your philosophy. So there's a prominent curator in England who I remember around that 2006 timeframe when we had success and there were some other restitutions. He was very opposed to the restitution. He said it doesn't make sense to give these back to, you know, the grandchildren, nieces, and things like that. These are artworks that belong to the people, right? That we've had them in our museums, in our public museums, and people deserve to see them. And that's, you know, there is a case to be made for that. If you have a communist system, for example, where there's no private property, then yes, the property does belong to the people. Tellingly, none of these people ever say that about their own property. It's always someone else's property that belongs to the public, but their own house probably won't be donated to the public. So as long as we have private property, I think the correct solution is to return. And there is a case actually that Simon had, the paintings in the film, the Franz von Stuck, which serves two purposes here. One, it's an example of an artwork that had different titles. Often the artists actually don't give titles to their paintings, they're given by the dealers, and so each time they're sold, it might be a different one. What was the sensibility and
it was sin or sensuality.
Yeah, but
he'd done about 24 in that series.
Yeah, but there were
virtually identical titles.
Yeah, so I had a person who lives here in Los Angeles in the hills, and he contacted me and he said he got this claim from Simon. And would I assist him? I said, well, you know, ordinarily I'm on the other side of these things. And he said, well, you don't understand. If it is, I want to give it back. And so I said, okay, well, I'll represent you under, you know, that condition, and we'll do some research. And he was concerned because it had been given as a gift to him. He had it over his fireplace, I think, for 40 years, something like that, or more. And was, of course, very accustomed to having it and considered it his. And the issue was that the immediately prior owner, so who had bought it for him in the gallery, it had one name, and in Haberstock, you remember that name, one of the art dealers, in his catalog it had a slightly different name, so it was sensitivity or sensibility or something like that. And so I went up to the Getty Museum, pointing that way, right? Is it that way? Whichever direction it is, right? I went to the Getty Museum, which has really the world's best library for provenance research, because they collect basically every art book imaginable. And I went and did research on this artist who I had not heard of before, Franz von Stuck, but he's a Bavarian artist, sort of pre-impressionist. And I went, and they had old catalogs, and I saw this picture in a, I think, 1903 catalog with the same name. So there was a portrait of it, and it had the picture and the name that Haberstock used, and then we had the picture with a different name. So it was obviously an identical painting that had been sold under two different or slightly different names. And so when I showed that to my client, he agreed then to give it back to Simon. So I think that's the just result, right? It's the correct result, and I think there are people in the world, there may be one or two at least, who do that and give the artworks back. But as Simon mentioned, it's usually a long, complicated ordeal in these cases.
If only they were all like that one.
Yeah,
That was marvelous. He helped me load the painting into the back of my old Jaguar, and shook my hand, and we sent each other, cards at the end of the year. Well, it goes to show if the collectors get a good lawyer, all things are possible.
Well, no, this was it was a condition of me representing him because, as I said, I don't usually.
He was a very, very decent man, but they're few and far between, unfortunately.
Jonathan,